Hi everyone, it's RJ from Emerald City Hockey. The NHL trade deadline is 3 days away, and trade talk is already heating up. Monday's trade between the Avs and Ducks got things started, and there's sure to be a bunch of trades coming between now and March 21st. In this video, I'm going to explain what the NHL trade deadline is and how it works, so you can follow all the league news over the coming days and know exactly what's going on. So let's get started. And I guess the first question to ask is, what exactly is the NHL trade deadline? Well, there's a lot of talk about deadline day. The trade deadline isn't a day, but a moment in time. It's the latest time in the season that teams can complete trades. Fans of other sports like football, baseball, or basketball will probably be familiar with this concept. Every season, the NHL sets a date and time after which trades without certain restrictions are no longer permitted. This is done to keep competitive balance toward the end of the season and into the playoffs. This year, the trade deadline is March 21st at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. Although, keep in mind, if you're following along with all the news this year, there will be a number of trades that get announced up to about an hour after that deadline. Now, all those trades were actually filed before the deadline, but due to the high volume of trade calls at the league registry, it takes a while for the logjam to sort itself out and for all those trades to actually get reported. Now, you may have caught my qualifier earlier that trades without certain restrictions aren't permitted after the deadline. And that's because, like in Major League Baseball, the NHL trade deadline actually isn't a hard deadline on trades. Teams can still make trades after the deadline is passed, but any player traded afterward is ineligible to play in that season's playoffs. So while there is the rare post-deadline trade, it usually involves low-profile players on non-playoff teams. That restriction makes the trade deadline a pretty effective stopping point, as many pre-deadline trades involve players who teams plan to use in the playoffs, as we'll see later on. So now that we know what the trade deadline is, let's take a look at what kind of assets that teams trade. And you can generally break it down into three categories of assets: NHL players, prospects, and draft picks. NHL players is pretty straightforward. That's players who are in the NHL right now. Prospects are recent draft picks who aren't in the NHL yet. When a team trades a prospect who hasn't signed a professional contract yet, they're trading the exclusive rights to sign that player. And finally, draft picks are selections in a future NHL entry draft that teams can use to select draft-eligible junior hockey players. There are 7 rounds in the NHL draft, so you'll see traded picks listed by the year the pick is in and the round of the draft, 1st through 7th. So for example, a 2022 4th round pick. So those are the 3 types of assets that will be traded. So now let's look at team strategy when approaching the trade deadline. And when you watch trade deadline coverage, you'll generally see teams split into 3 categories: buyers, sellers, and then the rest. So buyers are generally teams at the top of the league standings who are going to make the playoffs. They want to improve on the roster they have and add pieces that are going to help them during a playoff run. Buyers are usually going to look to acquire NHL players while giving up draft picks and prospects. For many teams in the buyer category, there's often a desire to not take anyone off the current roster when making trades. What's most important for these teams is improving their situation right now. Sellers are the opposite. They're generally teams at the bottom of the standings who are not going to make the playoffs. Their goal is to get longer-term assets in return for players who are on expiring contracts or otherwise won't be useful to them further down the road. Sellers will usually trade away NHL players and acquire draft picks and prospects, all with the future in mind. And then there's the others. These are the teams that don't fall neatly into either the buyer or seller categories. They're usually near the playoff bubble, not guaranteed to make the playoffs, but not quite out of the race either. These teams often don't feel the need to mortgage the future to help right away, but they don't necessarily want to make their current roster any worse by trading away players for future assets. Sometimes these teams will make a minor trade or two, but generally they'll do nothing or stand pat at the trade deadline. Now that we've established the categories of teams, let's take a look at a few different types of trades you're likely to see before the trade deadline. The first type of trade is a rental trade, which is a trade involving a player who is in the final year of his contract and is approaching unrestricted free agency. We use the term rental because the team acquiring the player essentially rents the player for the remainder of the season without any guarantee he'll stay with the team beyond that time. Let's take a look at an example of a rental trade so we can get a better idea of what it looks like in practice. And thankfully, we have a very good recent example, one completed just 3 days ago between the Colorado Avalanche and the Anaheim Ducks. The Ducks sent defenseman Josh Manson to the Avalanche in exchange for prospect Drew Helleson and Colorado's second-round pick in 2023. So let's apply what we just learned about buyers and sellers. You can see the Avalanche are getting an NHL player in Manson while giving up a draft pick and a prospect. So they're the clear buyers here. And that makes a lot of sense because they're the number one team in the NHL right now. It is Stanley Cup or bust for the Avs this year. Meanwhile, the Ducks are giving up an NHL player and acquiring a pick and a prospect, so that signals that they're sellers. The Ducks' odds of making the playoffs currently sit at around 2%, so they certainly fall into that category. So let's look at why this trade was made, and we'll start from Anaheim's perspective. The Ducks had Josh Manson on their roster, and Manson's status as a pending unrestricted free agent forced them into making a decision on whether to keep him or not. Now, when I say pending unrestricted free agent, that basically means that Manson's contract ends in July. So at that point, he will be free to sign with any team he wants, and the chances that he would return to Anaheim are probably pretty low. The Ducks, being well out of the playoff picture, don't get much value from holding on to Manson for the remainder of the season. But having Manson for the next few months is very valuable to a team like Colorado, who are sure to make the playoffs and need some help on defense. So that's why this deal came together. The Avs get a player who will help them win now, and they don't have to weaken their current roster to do it. While the Ducks get a pair of assets that can help them win several years down the road when they figure to be more competitive. They're able to recoup some value for Manson rather than risk losing him for nothing in the offseason. In short, it makes sense for both sides, which is why these types of deals are so common around the trade deadline. So when you see players on losing teams whose contracts are about to expire, chances are they're the subject of trade conversations around the trade deadline. So the next category of trades I'm going to call purchase trades, and I struggled to come up with a good name for this category, but my reasoning is with these trades, buyers aren't renting players on expiring deals, but rather purchasing players with more term. This type of trade is pretty similar to the rental trade, but with the key difference being that the player who's the centerpiece of the deal has term left on his contract beyond the current season. You'll still generally see a buyer and a seller come together to make this type of trade, but the buying team sees the player they're bringing in as someone who fits for now and the future. Let's look at an example from the 2020 trade deadline, where the Tampa Bay Lightning acquired Blake Coleman from the New Jersey Devils in exchange for prospect Nolan Foote and Vancouver's 2020 first-round pick. Coleman was 28 years old at the time, and by the time the Devils were ready to be competitive again, Coleman would be past his prime. The Lightning, who were Stanley Cup contenders, identified Coleman as a missing piece who could push them over the top. The fact that Coleman was signed until 2021 at a bargain $1.8 million cap hit only made him a more attractive trade target for the Lightning, who were very close to the salary cap. One thing to note is that buyers generally have to pay a higher price in these types of trades because the selling team doesn't have the same time pressure to move someone. If the Lightning didn't match New Jersey's asking price for Coleman, the Devils could have just kept him and tried to trade him again in the summer or later. That differs from our rental trade example, where the Ducks just didn't have that option for Josh Manson. While the Devils didn't need to move Coleman when they did, the return of a first-round pick and a high-level prospect was worth it. While the Lightning probably aren't too worried about having lost those future assets after winning 2 Stanley Cups with Coleman's help. Alright, so the next category is third-party broker trades, and I didn't really want to get into these because they're complicated, and in a video like this, I'm trying to keep everything at a more introductory level, but you will see them this trade deadline and likely in years to come. So I am going to explain them, and hopefully you can come away with at least a basic understanding of what they are and why they occur. Third-party broker trades are trades where a third team gets involved in order to artificially lower a player's cap hit, and they're paid an asset, usually a draft pick, to do so. Now, this video is trade deadline explained, not salary cap explained, so I'm going to try to keep things as simple as possible. When a team trades away a player, they are allowed to retain salary on that player's contract, up to 50% of it. So let's say, for example, you're trading away a player on an expiring contract with a $4 million cap hit. You are allowed to retain up to $2 million, 50% of that cap hit. Now, one reason a team would do this is to increase the value of the asset you're trading away. All of a sudden, the team acquiring the player in our example now has a $4 million player at only $2 million against their cap, which makes him more valuable and increases the return that you can get for him. This often helps teams fit a player under the salary cap at the trade deadline. Let's say, for example, you're a team with only $2 million of cap space, but now you can fit a $4 million player onto your roster because the other team is willing to retain salary. But let's say you only have $1 million of cap space, and you want to fit that same $4 million player onto your roster. There is a way to get that done, and that's through a third-party broker trade. The original team, Team A, retains half of the player's salary, $2 million in this example, trades him to the third-party team, Team B, who retains half again, half being $1 million this time, and then finally flips that player to you, Team C, with the $1 million cap hit. And of course, you'll throw a draft pick Team B's way for their trouble. Here's a real-life example from last year's trade deadline where Matthias Janmark went from Chicago to San Jose and then finally to Vegas, with the Blackhawks and Sharks each retaining 50%, so Vegas can get a $2.25 million player for about $560,000 in cap hit. And the Sharks, the third-party team, got a fifth-round pick to make it all work. So hopefully that all makes sense, and when you see those deals in the coming days, that's what's going on. So those three types of trades should cover the majority of what you'll see before a given trade deadline. But there are a couple more trades I do want to touch on real quick. You'll also have some minor league player swaps and some change of scenery trades where a player might be unhappy or want more opportunity elsewhere and the team will oblige and trade him somewhere that's going to be a better fit. So here are a couple recent examples of those. Usually those don't involve any high profile players, so you don't need to worry about those kinds of trades too much. So that's it for this trade deadline explained video. Hopefully you have a better idea of what the trade deadline is, how it works, and you can follow along with all the drama and intrigue that is sure to take place over the next few days. But before I go, I want to ask, is there anything else you want to know about the trade deadline? I tried to keep this video to a reasonable length, but there's a lot more I could have talked about. So please let us know in the comments. Any questions, comments you have, Dylan and I read them all, and we'd be happy to clarify anything about the trade deadline or hockey in general. If you like this video, if you learned something, give it a thumbs up. It really helps us out. And if you really liked it, hit the subscribe button to be notified of all of our future videos. You can follow us also on social media at Emerald City HKY on Twitter, same thing on Instagram, Emerald City HKY, and listen to our podcast, The Deep Dive, where we provide weekly in-depth coverage of the Seattle Kraken. Links to all of that, of course, will be in the description below. Enjoy the trade deadline, and thanks for watching.